Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Strasbaugh, Associate Director of Community Programs for Seattle Theater Group. To aid in making this event accessible, I'll describe that I'm a white woman with reddish blonde brown hair. I would like to start today by recognizing that Seattle Theater Group acknowledges that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the ancestral land of the Duwamish, Squamish, and Muckleshoot tribes, and that we occupy this land. This acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, but serves as a first step in honoring the land we occupy. This afternoon's event is the STG's The People's Theater Talks. This conversation is the first in a series focused on race and social justice within today's performing arts. These community gatherings will virtually bring in experts in areas of theater, music, dance, visual art, and more to explore the ways in which historically marginalized communities are being represented, misrepresented, absent, or changing on stages and in art mediums. Particular shows may be mentioned, but they're not the focus of these timely events. So today's topic is disproportionate casting in Broadway and beyond. Our guests are Bandhu, an award-winning actor, producer, advocate. He has acted on Broadway and off-Broadway and throughout the regions. He's also received an Obie Award for his advocacy work, co-founding the Asian American Performers Action Coalition. Victor Vazquez is also joining us. Victor has held casting calls in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. Victor holds a master's degree with distinction from the University of Oxford in the UK, and Victor is a member of the Casting Society of America and a 2020 Theater Communications Group Rising Leader of Color. And our moderator is Valerie Curtis Newton. Valerie is currently the head of directing at the University of Washington School of Drama and also serves as the founding artistic director for the Hansberry Project, a professional African-American theater lab. She's worked with professional theaters across the country, and we're honored she's leading the conversation today. Welcome to Valerie, Pun, and Victor. We are so grateful that you're all here. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Valerie.
Hello, everyone. I'm Valerie Curtis Newton, and I'm a Black woman with gray hair. And today I'm wearing my scholarly horned-rimmed glasses. Pun and Victor, do you want to give them a little description of who you are?
Hi, everybody. Happy to be here. I'm an Asian man against a white background wearing a blue shirt.
Hey, everyone. My name is Victor Vazquez. I use he, him, his pronouns. And I'm calling in from Harlem in New York City, the ancestral lands of the Munsee, Lenape, and Wappinger peoples. I also wanted to say that I'm the son of Mexican immigrants from the state of Jalisco, which is the home of tequila and mariachi. I am light-skinned. I'm wearing a white shirt, some gold chains, and I've got a short fade cut, and I'm sitting in my home office with many lush plants behind me.
Great. I'm excited to have this conversation. I saw this quote in Playbill. They were talking about the production of The Visitor at the Public. And the quote goes, "As the theater and countless others across the country remained dark, national unrest over the killing of Black individuals led arts companies to reckon with the centering of white characters and artists on and off their stages. This has included examination not just of whose stories are being told, but by whom and through what lens." So the question that I want to ask first is Broadway still the great white way? What do you think?
Well, one of the things that AAPAC, the Asian American Performers Action Coalition, which is the group that I co-founded, does is we do statistics for Broadway and the entire New York City theater ecosystem in terms of representation of actors, directors, writers, designers. We're also now starting to count producers and general managers and administrators. And we've been doing it we have statistics going back 13 years now. This is a historic Broadway season that's starting right now, post COVID. or we're still in the thick of COVID, but as we try to reopen, and I think it has a lot to celebrate. There's 7 plays written by Black writers this season, which is unprecedented, certainly higher than in any that we've had in the last 13 years. But our most recent report, called the Visibility Report, encompasses the 18-19 season, which was the last full complete season before the shutdown. And the latest statistics that we have are actually not that great. If you look at how we were as an industry before the shutdown, before the racial reckoning, just some statistics to throw out there. Almost 2/3, about 66% of all roles on Broadway went to white actors. They were 80% of all lead roles, 90% of lead roles when you were looking at plays only. Writers and composers produced on Broadway were almost 90% white. 94% of directors on Broadway were white. 93% of designers. So the story, it's the same old story, that the Great White Way is predominantly still being programmed for and by white people. And so that is something that, with the racial reckoning, with efforts like We See You White American Theater, which I hope people are familiar with. If they're not, please Google it, which has created demands for changing the theater ecosystem. Things are slowly changing, but we do have a lot of work to do.
I think one of the big shifts that has made this moment happening with the Black plays happening on Broadway is that, as a part of the racial reckoning, the community has decided to take ownership of getting its story out there. And there are more collaborations by producers of color working together to get the work on stages. Victor, can you talk a little bit about casting strategies? I know that the 3 major ones that we talk about all the time are colorblind, color conscious, and traditional casting. Are those strategies still the main ways to go, or are there innovations with regard to casting?
Of course, and I'll talk about that in just a second. I just wanted to also echo what Pun just shared with the AAPAC report. That's the Asian American Performers Action Coalition. And I have to say, Pun, I'm such a fan of this report every single year. I think without data, right, just as like Brene Brown says, in the absence of data, we will always make up stories. And for me, what this report does is that it ensures that we are all talking about the same facts. And you can't look away from these facts, right? I think one of the things that I want to highlight in order to answer my question is that there's this section in this report that's, the question is, are gatekeepers biased, right? And the data shows that the top positions of power in the New York theater industry are filled almost exclusively with white leaders. In the nonprofit sector, that's 88.4%. And on the Broadway sector, that's 94.1%. Now, when we're talking about whose imagination is at the forefront, clearly it is cisgendered, it is heteronormative, it is white, right? And when we're talking about what we're seeing right now on Broadway, my question is, how long will that last? And I think, Valerie, you posed this earlier in one of our conversations, where is this a moment or a movement? And I have that question too, because I'm not looking to the white producers and the white executives at these leadership institutions to make a commitment to change. I'd actually like for them to step aside, and I like them to invite more people by perhaps stepping aside and redistributing their power to come let their imaginations take hold of Broadway's future, of New York theater's future, of the American theater future. And I want to highlight how specific of a request that is from me, my end, right, as a casting director, but also as the owner and founder of a casting company in New York City, is that I believe, to Ibram X. Kendi's word, right, in How to Be Anti-Racist, one of the central tenets that he lays out in his book of how to be anti-racist, right, is the redistribution of power. And so I just want to sort of like name that. To me, the answer is not about what commitments can be made. It's actually about who are you letting step into this equation at the top. Now, to answer your question,
can I just, for 1 second, Victor, can I just jump in on this point? I agree with you, and yet I'm not sure that stepping aside is the strategy, the move quite yet, because the organizations themselves are still white supremacist and racist. So any good global majority leader who steps inside those machines has to be really prepared for the onslaught of the institutional mechanisms that are not really going to allow change to happen. It doesn't just changing the face of the person at the top without actually shifting the organization just causes more harm, an equal amount of harm. But I think the idea of power shifting is really powerful, and we definitely should employ strategies to do that.
100%, Valerie. I totally agree that, a lot of these institutions a lot of the racism is institutionalized and in very unconscious, pervasive ways. And we need to understand what are those obstacles to true equity and how do we dismantle them institutionally. But, if you think about who has the power, according to our report, 100% of all the artistic directors in the not-for-profits that we track, the top 18 not-for-profits, which are predominantly white institutions, are led by white leaders. And things won't change until some of that power is ceded, and you do get artists of color with the power and the agency to make change. And of course, yes, they have to be supported. I mean, that's been my question too. There have been a lot of new appointments of associate artistic directors being hired in New York, at least, that are of color. But my question always is, well, what power do they have? And so I think part of the conversation that is changing is sort of how do you share power, and I agree with there've actually been some white artistic directors nationally, actually, that have made the decision to step aside specifically for more artists of color to be able to fill those positions, and I think that's great. But to your point, Valerie, I also think that it shouldn't just be sort of a yes, power needs to be ceded in order for true equity to occur, but I don't want to give the impression that that white artists don't have a hand in changing things, and in fact, a lot of the change that has happened in the past 5 years or so has been because there's been more of an understanding that power needs to be more shared.
Yeah, I think boards and producers, artistic management needs to begin that transition before a person of color steps into a leadership position, because the work of actually having to convert the mindset of the donor class is a crazy job, which is why the shift in with what's going on right now on Broadway is that more of us are becoming producers. So we're able to make structures that can do less harm. But I don't disagree with you, Victor, about this power sharing. We have to figure out a strategy for it that allows it to happen quickly and allows us not to be drowned.
Absolutely, and I think that there's, that there are many strategies that are needed, right? Both radical and what's that other word where it's like a little just
incremental.
Incremental. And I'm not such a fan of the incremental change because, to Pun's point, my question is, why now? Why hasn't this changed before, right? Why is that commitment suddenly sort of activated? Is it because of the pressure of the community? Is it because of the political moment? Or is it because it's fundamentally just? Now, to answer the question that you
I think
posed to
it's
me,
both. I
Valerie.
think it's fundamentally just. And I think the reason that there is change now is because of the pressure. And because we are changing as global majority people. We are changing in terms of what we will accept.
Yeah. And I mean, I think just to answer the question that you posed, for me, it's in 2019, pre-pandemic, I decided to enter this space in New York. I was already a casting director, but I decided to open up shop. And I decided to open up my own casting company. Because in New York City particularly, right, there are perhaps over 100 casting directors in New York City. And we don't have the exact data just because we have not taken that sort of step yet. But from the looks of it, and from even, I'm on the board of the Casting Society of America, which is a national board of casting directors in television, theater, and film. And in New York City, the casting community remains predominantly homogenous. It remains predominantly white. And for me, this is a question of who gets to imagine the world. Now, we talk about casting. Casting to me is it's a cultural engine, right? We have the capacity to really influence how the world imagines itself. Meaning that if we are casting a major film, a major TV project, this creates culture, right? We get to see either ourselves reflected or not in certain stories, right? And for me, it is so crucial to see and understand that there should be people of color, people of the global majority, queer folks, people with disabilities, people who speak multiple languages behind the casting table, because we get to also imagine the world differently. We get to imagine the world as we see it, right? And so, to your point, to the conversations of color conscious, of traditional casting, I sort of reject all that. And to me, one of the articles that a director and I, Lavinia and I, published on HowlRound is this introduction of identity conscious casting. Because, right, if we're talking about traditional sort of, or colorblind or color conscious, identity conscious casting actually makes space for the wholeness of an artist to be considered, not just the color, but it's actually about the complexity of intersectionality. It's about the complexity of how an artist can both be Black, femme, queer, and Latinx, right? Like that these complexities are actually crucial in our understanding when we're talking about artists, not as objects, not as commodities, but as artists. And that for us to consider their whole identity in the making of art can actually help crack open different conversations for all of us.
Can you talk just really briefly? That's a beautiful concept and a great strategy. Can you talk about what the different questions are going into that kind of process that make it different than the way we do it right now? I bet it starts with the casting notice, for example, like how the word gets out and how people are invited in, right?
Well, I think it starts even before that. It starts in a conversation with a collaborative team, right? With all the stakeholders, be it the producer, the writer, the director, the choreographer, the designers, the casting director, right? And it's a real conscious conversation about color, right? About colorism, about ability and disability, about bodies, about shape. And I think instead of erasing all these parts of a process, actually inviting them in at the beginning can help all of us land collectively on a strategy, which would be a casting strategy moving forward to find those people as specific as they might be, or as broad, right? Because then the language that is sort of collaborated in that conversation can help find itself into a breakdown, right? we can be intentional about someone's skin tone that we want to invite into this conversation, or not, right? We can be open, or we can be intentional. And I think that that's where, for me, every project deserves a different casting strategy, but it's important for us to name and talk about these very real topics at the beginning of every conversation, for us to have a very intentional process.
I think that's so important, because, you know, when things go left, the first thing that everyone says is we didn't think it would happen. That moment we didn't know it was going to happen.
Yeah.
So following up on this idea, can we talk a little bit about the Hamilton effect, particularly as it relates to historical work, and like where it is that, in this sense of what Victor's talking about, the identity conscious casting, where what might be called something more traditional is the right choice, and when it isn't the right choice. How do we come to have those discussions?
I can talk about that for a little bit. First, I just wanted to quickly back up, and I think it's important for us to note, you know, we sort of glossed over that there are suddenly now more producers of color producing on Broadway. And I just wanted to just hammer home the fact that, like, when you do create space, there will always be those people of color that you're looking for. You know, in the past, there's been the understanding that, like, oh, well, you know, we haven't reached out to producers of color. There aren't a lot out there. You know,
we don't know where they are.
We don't know where they are. We don't know whether they're just not interested. You know, they don't have the money. They don't have or whatever. You know, and so those assumptions have to be thrown aside. The same thing was applied to actors as well. Oh, we can't cast an Asian play, you know, in Indiana because it's so hard to find Asian actors. And I'm here to tell you, there are fantastic Asian actors everywhere if you do the job of you know, first of all, hiring a casting director like Victor who has relationships with fantastic actors of color, you know, but also doing the outreach. You'll always be able to find them. And you know, I'm reminded too, if we actually in the report did a deep dive into, suddenly we noticed that, like, more directors of color were being hired, specifically to direct more works of color in the not-for-profit space, not in the Broadway space. And they were, and then did a deep dive as to who these new directors were that were making their way into our report for the first time. And there was an Obie Award-winning director who directed something off Broadway 10 years ago, but had never opened up new opportunities for her. You know, she's a Yale School of Drama trained director as well, but that never opened up opportunities for her in the mainstream non-for-profit theater until now. You know, and so the question is, who are we overlooking? Who, you know, and what are the barriers that we're placing that do prevent these really talented people, artists, from entering an equal playing field? So in regards to the Hamilton effect and inclusive casting, we saw a direct correlation in our statistics in terms of you know, for the past 10 years before Hamilton, inclusive casting stats had stayed really stagnant for about 10 years. Nothing really moved the needle that much until Hamilton came about. And then suddenly we saw, you know, from 10% in the last season that we have statistics, inclusive casting was responsible for almost 30% of all Broadway casting, you know, which is amazing. And it was responsible for, you know, having that year be the record breaker for the hiring of actors of color. Yet at the same time, to Victor's point, you look at sort of where they were cast, and the majority of those roles were cast in chorus roles. And so,
yeah.
And then, you know, so you add to that analysis the fact that in that season there was only 2 projects on Broadway that actually were written by writers of color. One of them was produced by a not-for-profit, and so most of the narratives were still white narratives being told by white leading actors, and yes, there was more diversity because Broadway producers, I think, figured out that the more diversity you have, usually that means more diversity in the audience as well, and more ticket sales. But it wasn't really fundamentally changing the paradigm of whose stories were being told. And then you compare that to the not-for-profits, they actually reduced the amount of inclusive casting in that year. And in fact, they increased the amount of identity casting that year because they told more racially specific stories that actually, hired more actors of color and also designers of color and directors of color, and that little shift of strategy of changing the narratives to tell more stories of communities of color was responsible for actually increasing hiring of actors of color by 6% in the not-for-profits, versus on Broadway, actors of color only increased about 0.5% from the year previously. So if you look at sort of what are the strategies for increasing casting for actors of color, absolutely, I think that inclusive casting should continue to be done. You need to look at you need to have an understanding and think an analysis of the fact that most of the roles out there are not racially specific. Race is not part of the story being told. And so it shouldn't matter, what color the actor is, in this role. And we can talk further about like whether, race does change the role or the impact of those casting decisions. But so that should continue to happen. But in addition to that, we have to also make a commitment to tell more racially specific stories, because statistics show that that is actually the best strategy to putting more actors of color on stage.
I think that goes back to Victor's earlier point about the difference between transaction and relationship, right? That in the regions, they've taken a more relationship-based approach to inclusivity, allowing us the space to tell our stories and are claiming our ownership of their space, versus the sort of what goes on in New York, which is how do we get butts in seats? To the extent that our presence is commodified, then we get people's attention. Mm-hmm. I think there's also something about in what you just said, Pun, about our ability as global majority folks to have all of it open to us. That none of what we're talking about is an either or proposition, right? It's always both and. Yes, identity is important, and our stories and our voices are important. And reimagining the world, as Victor talked about earlier, from the very beginning in more inclusive ways is also, it should be both. It should not be either or. And I think very often institutions latch on to one way or the other way and have a hard time doing the dance of improvisation based on circumstances on the ground.
I think, let's talk about sort of the data as well, right? Like, it's not just circumstantial, it's actually available for us. If we look at the UCLA School of Social Science Hollywood Diversity Report, which is also released annually by the School of Social Sciences at UCLA, we see that year after year, the data shows that if your cast is over 35% global majority people, right? Global majority actors, POC, Black, Indigenous, if you cast your project diversely, it actually makes for better box office sales, period, across the board. I mean, in 2020, people of color were responsible for the majority of opening weekend domestic ticket sales for 6 of the top 10 films, right? And then if we look at that same report, again, UCLA Hollywood Diversity Report, we also see that a recent McKinsey and Company report estimates that the industry is leaving about $10 billion on the table by not including more Black talent and Black talent and stories in its creative ecosystem. So I think that there are very direct parallels that we can make to Broadway, to theater, from what we're learning in TV and film. And what is clear is that there is a fear, there is an insecurity, and I think it's still racism at hand, right? And that white supremacy is actually the continuation of a dominant white imagination. And to go back to the Hamilton effect, for me, yeah, absolutely. Look, what we're talking about is not just the representation of art on a creative field. We're talking about employment. And it's, for me as a casting director, it's so crucial to have that understanding that we're not just here to theorize, right? We're also here to talk about practical matters that have an economic impact all across the board in our country for artists. And while I'm absolutely supporting that Hamilton is paying, right, putting money in pockets of so many really great POC, Black, Indigenous creatives and actors, I also challenge the industry to continue to cast these actors, right, to create more work that just doesn't center white protagonists, that allows actors to step into characters that might be reflective as well of their own identities, right? Again, complexity is key and multiple things can be true, right? But also what I want to make explicitly sort of like known is I want to go back to the definition of casting, and this is my definition of casting, right? What is casting? Casting is an arcane tradition. I use the word arcane intentionally. It's an arcane tradition infused into a modern day culture making machine. It works in the arenas where national and global conversations about culture and politics take place. Casting is how we imagine the world. So to talk about Hamilton, to talk about the conversation we're having today, I cannot divorce it from culture and politics, right? Because casting actually has those that impact in both of those spaces as it does in the economic space. And so again, this is not a conversation about theory. This is a conversation that is rooted in urgent matter. And the urgent matter is that still to this day, actors of color and Black actors and Indigenous actors are cast less than their white counterparts, right? Pun has all the data and has shared all the data in the theater sector. And I just, again, want to highlight TV and film as well, because I don't want us to get lost in this idea that the problem has been solved, because it hasn't. In TV and film, right? Let me just sort of get these numbers so I can get them right. In the same report, the UCLA Hollywood Diversity Report states that 3 out of 10 leads in film, 3 out of 10 leads in film are people of color. And in television, broadcast, scripted, and digital, it's 2.4 out of 10 leads are people of color. That's less than 30% across the board. Now, in order for us to enter a space where we are even matching national employment data, those numbers would need to double. And in the American theater, those numbers would sometimes need to be multiplied by 5. So I think that we are still in a state of an emergency, and every single person who holds power must know that we are looking at employment across the board, and it's crucial that we activate some sort of response, whether it's local, hyperlocal, or national, right? Everything is necessary, because right now we need to think about the employment of Black, Indigenous and POC actors and actors with disabilities, right?
I
Because it's important that we put money in their pockets, because allowing them to sustain themselves in this industry, for them to pay their rent, to feed their families, to imagine a future for themselves is absolutely critical.
I love what you're saying, Victor. I especially want to hammer home the point that you're making in terms of, we are making culture, and culture has a direct relationship to who we are as a society, and there's a direct line, I think, between you can see it between the stereotypes that are out there for, let's say, Asian women, and the hypersexualization of Asian women as temptresses, as prostitutes, as, when you think of shows like Miss Saigon or, things like that, just those images that get reinforced over and over and over again have a direct relationship to how Asians are treated, on the street, with the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, for instance, during COVID. Or, for instance, what happened in Atlanta, that the gunning down of 6 Asian masseuses, that perpetrator, that murderer, actually literally said he was doing it because they were temptresses, and yet at the same time, the sheriff could, with no irony at all, say that it hadn't been proven that race was part of the motivation. You know what I mean? And so, like, just our understanding of how these stereotypes filter into an analysis of race is so we're still blind to it in a way. We don't see the direct impact that it has, and it does. And this is an example from TikTok that I recently saw. But a history professor tried to ask his history students, how many white heroes in history, or how many white men in history can you name? And of course it was super easy, and it became much more difficult as the question was, how many Black people in history can you name? How many Latinx people can you name? How many Asian people in history can you name? And of course, it's really problematic when all of the protagonists and heroes that we see are white, and all of the, the people of color are never seen as the good guys, and so how does that affect how society views people of color? I think it's huge, and I think I think you're right, Victor, to emphasize that, because we're not just talking about casting, we're not just talking about the industry here, but we're talking about a larger moral imperative. I think that we have the ability as theater makers and culture makers to actually make a difference here.
And part of the evidence that it's so important is the backlash against critical race theory is actually in direct relationship to our awakening and speaking truth. So the idea that we want to change the narratives so there were no bad slaveholders. Because why? Because we don't want young white people to feel guilt or to feel racist or to feel their privilege. So we have to eliminate all that talk. And artists, we fly directly into the face of all that. We're like, no, there have to be more stories. We each have to tell our story, and our story often involves the trauma of racism, of sexism, homophobia, all of those things. And when we call them out and identify where they exist in institutions, we are the problem. So there need to be laws passed to keep us from talking. There need to be boycotts to keep us from writing or producing or putting things on television or in film or on stage, because we undercut the idea that it's always been gravy and aren't Americans amazing and isn't whiteness benevolent. And when we stand up and say those things, they come for us. And I think the economic piece that Victor's highlighting is really important. Employment cannot be understated. Putting dollars in pockets cannot be understated. So if we have the chance to move the needle there, it's very important. And it does have the cultural and political impact that you guys are both talking about.
Mhm.
So if you could wish for 2 things to change, what would your 2 things be? The most Victor talked about ceding power. Are there other things that are in your dream vision for how we get where we need to go?
Ceding power, ceding power, ceding power. And I mean that all across the board. I know that that voice can seem radical. And I invite people who might be feeling uncomfortable by that to just sit with that discomfort, right? Valerie, you named a characteristic of white supremacy, right? Which is the right to comfort. That people who believe that they have the right to keep their comfort level consistent when conversations about power, about racism, about justice aren't only uncomfortable for people of color, people of the global majority, but sometimes they're deadly. Sometimes they're violent, right? And so I think for me, holding on to that radical notion that ceding power is actually important to this conversation. And again, another characteristic of white supremacy, and this is there's language on this online, it's power hoarding. And we've seen that across the board in our industry, nationwide, and here specifically in New York City as well. I can't tell you how immense of a change it is to start working with other agents, right? I'm not a casting agent. I just want to clarify that. I believe the title card named me as a casting agent. That's not real. Casting agents are not a thing. I'm a casting director. An agent is a representative who represents talent. I do not represent talent. I work in the casting side, right? A manager also represents talent. But what I want to say is that being able to foster a relationship with agents and managers as a casting director, with producers who are of the global majority, actually helps to change the ecosystem that we're functioning in. And also for me to build relationships with artistic directors regionally who are working in their own theater companies, and I can plug in to support the change that they're enacting within their companies. Because I think one of the things that I want to sort of like highlight from the comment that was made before is that none of us stand individually, right? As people of the global majority, it is not our onus to solve the problem of white supremacy. I'm not saying that. But I really do think that all of us in community can help combat that. And actually, the more of us that are in positions of power, working together collectively, not power hoarding, working together collectively to transform our ecosystem is also another radical notion that I just want to put on the table, because I'm not working on this alone. Though I might be one of few casting directors of color in New York City, I'm working hand in hand with my colleagues who are Black women in casting, my colleagues who are Black women in the management side, my colleagues who are Latinas running institutions as artistic directors, right? That is how I plug in. And I'm not here to solve the problem of white supremacy in casting by myself. I've actually got community, and we're working on that together.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on the point that you were talking about discomfort and comfort. I agree 100%. And in fact, I spend a lot of time out here talking about the fact that safe space and change making are antithetical to each other. Yeah. We don't need safe spaces. We need brave people in every space.
Yeah.
And being willing to step in to the places where, it could be career ending. And there are definitely dangers afoot, but the goal is more than worth it, is more than worth the risk. Pun, how about you? Do you have 2 things?
I Wow, only two.
Yes,
I
we're just starting. We're just starting.
I know, exactly. Baby steps. Well, I mean, I think what I would like to see change is sort of as Valerie, you've said before, Broadway traditionally has been about money, about the bottom line. And I think because of that, it's been very risk averse. It wasn't until something like Hamilton proved that people were willing to pay top dollar to see, predominantly actors of color on stage, that things changed. And w- while I'm this goes to sort of the question, the fear, Victor, that you had of like, it's great that things are changing this year, but is it a true sustained movement? Um, and I can point to the statistics from like the year after Hamilton. Suddenly, Hamilton like was a record breaker in terms of actors of color across the board, and then the year after that, it like dipped by like 27% because people were like, "Yeah, we did it! Check the box. Broadway's more diverse than Hollywood. Now we can have an all white Hello Dolly. And so." I'm not saying that there isn't room for productions like that. I'm just saying that um, I hope that these seven plays that coincidentally or not, or it's not a coincidence, I don't think, that they're also the first out of the gate, because that's when Broadway theaters were available, because a lot of the bigger projects are still in rehearsals, etc. And and also there's a lot of fear about how our audience is going to come back, and these sort of seven black plays are almost like the equivalent to me of like sending black soldiers out first, to test the waters, or and so we need to support these works, and audiences have a responsibility, hopefully, to come out and support them, because it really is significant, and it matters a lot. So I guess one thing I guess that's connected in that, like, I hope that audiences become much more politicized in how they use their purchasing power, and then also that producers don't see it as sort of a, uh, you know, like if any of them happen not to be financially successful, that the response then is sort of back to, well, we try, there just aren't audiences out there, and so um, those are two ways of thinking that I'd like to change. For me personally, as an Asian actor, I would also like to add a third thing that I'd love to change, and that is that while all of this talk about diversity is fantastic, while all of these Black shows are fantastic, one was just announced today, Pal Joey, The Revival, with Savion Glover co-directing. But it's fantastic, but I wish that the industry could understand that diversity is more than just a black and white issue, that so much of our diversity, of our racial conversation, our racial politic in this country has been black and white, and so binary, which is to be understood, um, and it shouldn't be about a there's a scarcity model at play here, where it's like, if we cede some territory to, let's say, black artists, then that means then, and you see it in our latest statistic, that Latinx artists decreased, and Asian artists decreased, and MENA artists decreased, and Native Americans are still not even on the board, in terms of having their stories and representation on stage. And so there needs to be much more conscious efforts to be able to understand um, that whose stories are still not being told, who's being omitted, and um, and that part of our cultural fabric and our our cultural trust as an industry and as a nation has to be more than just a conversation about Black and white issues.
That's so true. And the ways in which, you know, we are, the idea of intersectionality, that so many of us actually live our lived experiences in multiple spheres.
Yeah.
Right? So acknowledging that we are interconnected in a way is so important to make, you know, Latinx stories as important to me as Black stories, right? To make Asian stories as important to me as Black stories. And making sure that when I impact the system and make what little change I can from where I'm sitting, that I do my best to ensure that those changes exist for everyone. So that when we change how we cast, when we change what tech hours are, when we change whatever we change, that it does apply more and more across the board. I think those are important points to make for sure.
Valerie, can I say something just along those lines?
Sure.
6 years ago, when I first went to Mexico City for the first time in my life, I went for 2 weeks by myself. And as I toured around this historic, you know, space with such a history of imperialism, of colonialism, one of the things that I found the most shocking was to see the statues of indigenous gods defaced. So they would erase their faces, right? The statue would still stand, but the faces were gone. And there was something so striking in seeing that to me that it became a bit of, I mean, it became a major lesson in the history of erasure and the history of exclusion, and that those two things are actually connected. And I think what Pun is naming here is that when there is exclusion, right, there is erasure. And I do not like this word marginal. I do not like the word marginalization or marginalized, because it feels like a bit of a softball. And I want to name actually the active verb that happens in place of marginalization. It's exclusion. You are excluding people, right? And that exclusion leads to erasure. And I'm afraid, I'm really concerned about not just the artistic and creative exclusion and erasure, but I'm more afraid and concerned about the economic exclusion and erasure. Because in New York City particularly, right, and we see this nationally, but again, I'm speaking from hyperlocal and that's where I live. In New York City, Latinos, Latine folks are cast in such a small percentage. I think like if we look at the 10 years, a 10-year sort of employment graph of just Broadway, I believe that it's sort of like, oh God, I'm trying to remember it, but it like ranges between 1% and 3% across the board, right? On a 10-year trend. And I just think like one of the most diverse cities in the world, where the Latine population makes up a big majority of this, you know, of 5 boroughs in New York City, is excluded on the Broadway stage. And to Pun's point, so are Asian folks, so are indigenous folks, so are people with disabilities. And that erasure, that exclusion has active consequences. I believe that it also drives our artists out of the cities, and it drives them out of this space, right? It drives them out of our imaginations. And so whatever city you find yourself in, folks listening, I hope you check that next time you hear somebody use the soft word marginal. I hope you check them. I hope you correct and say, I just want to name that actually maybe the word we should be using is exclusion, is excluded. These are people who have been excluded, right? Because that feels like we can now have a conversation about that.
Great. Do we want to take some questions from folks? We've got like 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Do I see any questions? Sarah, do you have a question for us?
I am very curious. I mean, I think Victor and Pun and Valerie, you've all talked about the work that you've been doing. But I'm curious, Victor, I think you just mentioned a great point about how people with the word marginalized can continue these conversations. Are there other things that maybe those listening, people who are not actors or producers or directors, but people who are theater goers, supporters, things that they can do to keep this conversation going, or to make change?
I think that audiences have a tremendous amount of pressure, especially to bear, especially when it comes to subscribers to theater companies, for instance. You know, theater companies want your feedback, and when they get feedback like, you know, why isn't your season more diverse, or why wasn't this play cast more diversely, it really does make an impact. Even I mean, I was actually at the Inheritance on Broadway, and a white a white young man, actually in his 20s, turned to his father and was like, "Where are all the actors of color?" You know, and that to me was sort of like I don't know, a watershed moment, a galvanizing point, because like I just didn't expect, like, it's the that's when I know that sort of the conversation has um, moved from just being a conversation into a social movement, where society has moved. You know, when that level of consciousness and awareness um, is coming from, you know, a young white man, um, and so, you know, sometimes I think that. You know, to Victor's point before about like, it's not up to artists of color, you know, to like, we're tired. We've been working on this, you know, like now I want to see more white colleagues and white um, audience members, everyone stepping up and actually advocating for these issues. And sometimes, you know, or actually most of the time, I think those who are in the dominant class, who have most of the privilege and power, are able to enact much far greater change, perhaps, than you know, than a bunch of actors of color being, you know, complaining about like, we're not working enough, you know. So which of course is not what we're doing. We're actually naming the obstacles that we see, but there is a role here for our white advocates.
I think that there's also something about the fact, you know, in acting, an actor's job is to have an intention and then to get something from their scene partner. And the idea is to get the scene partner to do something, right? You can make your scene partner do something, feel something, or understand something. But the most important thing is to get them to do something. So when people are expressing their intention for there to be change, I encourage everyone to ask, but what are you doing? What's the thing you're doing? Not what are you thinking, not what are you feeling, but what are you doing? How are you supporting change? And eliminating the idea that you can be passive in this moment is really important. No one can just sit by and expect someone else to do the work. We all have to roll up our sleeves and get in there and do it.
The thing on that as well is that Lorraine Hansberry, who is the writer of A Raisin in the Sun, right? Brilliant, brilliant writer. In her book, To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, there's a letter in it where she says, the universe is in the details. And I believe that we do not need to, as audience members, only support projects, right, that are in alignment with our own identities, that we too can find ourselves in the stories of people who we presume are unlike us, right? and that it's in those very specific details that we see the universe. And for example, again, I know I'm keep bringing TV sometimes in, but like Never Have I Ever on Netflix by Mindy Kaling is one of the best shows I've seen in a long time. And this is about a South Asian teenager in high school. I am a 33-year-old gay man living in New York City, and I just adored that series. Because why? Not because I connected with, the South Asian culture, but it's because I was so enthralled by this story where I too learned so much about the culture, but that wasn't the point, right? The point was that I was falling in love with this story. And I just hope audiences out there, as you listen to this, again, remember the right to comfort is not ours, right? Move through our own comfortability, support art that is unlike us, and then see what we learn.
Another Hansberry quote, she said, if you want to do something, you have to do something.
I love it.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very, very much, all three of you. I am honored to have this conversation with you today, and so many things that I want to go back and rewatch this conversation. So many topics brought up, and really we were just hitting the top of so many things. So I encourage all of you watching to keep the conversation going in your communities. I think there were some amazing points of action that many of the speakers talked about today. And thank you so much for joining STG's the People's Theater Talks. I look forward to continuing these conversations with you, and we'll have future discussions and events on stgpresents.org. But thank you again to Valerie, Pun, and Victor. We appreciate you and all of your thoughts and experience. And to all of you who are watching, thank you and take care.
Thanks, everybody. Great conversation.